Good morning, Metalheads Internet. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. And today we are looking at the highly anticipated sixth studio album from Slipknot, entitled We Are Not Your Kind. Slipknot, arguably one of the most unique, identifiable, successful, and fascinating heavy metal bands of the last 20 years. They've sold millions of records, they've won Grammys, they've created a shit ton of controversy. At this point, they're even old enough to have influenced a whole lot of new modern music in the worlds of death metal, deathcore, metalcore, thrash metal, alternative metal, a new wave of new metal. They've even had influence on the modern hip-hop scene, with a lot of artists taking huge influence from the aggressive antics of Slipknot, particularly in their live shows. And speaking of, those live shows are the stuff of fucking legend, man. It's some of the most chaotic and insane shit you'll ever see on stage. It's violent, it's disgusting, it's abhorrent, it inspires some truly fucking insane mosh pits, and nowadays they have the money to put on an Alice Cooper-style shock rock show on top of all of that as well. What's most amazing to me about Slipknot, though, is their perseverance. I mean, these guys have suffered. They have gone through so much through their art and through their personal lives as well that has, again, been translated through art. They have pushed themselves to the absolute physical limit in ways that most mainstream bands would never even think of. And they're still fucking here too, and they still sound hungry, and they're still ready to experiment and try lots of new things. Say what you will about Slipknot, but there's no fucking arguing how goddamn fucking persistent they are. There's a lot to admire there. For all those reasons and more, there's a lot to look forward to in regards to We Are Not Your Kind, especially when you remember that their previous album was an incredibly emotional and cathartic one for the band, but let's be honest, musically speaking, maybe not their strongest. So it does beg the question almost immediately, where exactly does the band go on this record? Do they continue to linger on loss? Do they move into new directions? Do they step back? Do they try something new altogether? Is it a mixture of all of these different things? The answer to that is a little bit more complicated than what you would think, but I think it's also safe to say that there are things that Slipknot does on this record that none of you are expecting. Not at all. I'm sure many of you have seen interviews by now where Corey Taylor and Jim Root and most of the guys for Slipknot are touting around saying this is their most ambitious record, this is their darkest record, this is their heaviest record since Iowa and Volume 3. It captures the glory sounds of the old days and moves things into the future. You blah, 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 blah. I'm sure you've also read some incredibly positive reviews by now, and you may have even noticed that on the day of this album's release, it stood at 100 out of 100 on Metacritic. As of this recording, it stands at a 93, but that is still bloody impressive for literally a brand new album that, frankly, I don't think a lot of people have still had a lot of time to digest and think about. Back to the matter at hand, though. If you've seen those articles and you've seen those reviews, and for that matter, if you've already listened to a bit of the album yourself, you already know that most people seem to agree that this record is inherently more ambitious than previous records and features some of the most experimental recordings that Slipknot has done to date. I do think that there are a lot of ideas and concepts here that are incredibly new and interesting for Slipknot. I think that in some ways they really do push themselves to new sonic and musical heights. I think they still sound hungry and violent, and I think it's actually quite refreshing to see a mainstream heavy metal band pushing themselves into some of these directions. However, I also think to a certain extent that this record is being a little bit hindered in some aspects by straying a little bit too close to the early sounds of the band's career and by attempting a little too hard to recreate the exact aesthetic and emotions that came out of those records. To put it very simply, half of this record is Slipknot trying to write brand new material and challenge themselves, and the other half of this record is them just going, well, what worked in 1999? What worked in 2002? Just put that on here. Which isn't to say that anything that falls in the latter category is bad. Quite the opposite. This is still pretty good by most standards. But it does create a weird contrast for me personally when compared to the more avant-garde material. And what could have been the band's most powerful record ultimately just feels like a pretty good record. Better than All Hope Is Gone and better than The Gray Chapter, but nowhere near the level of Volume 3 in Iowa, which seems like an unfair comparison for me to make, but keep in mind, the band is also making those comparisons, so yeah, not that unfair at all, really. The first thing you'll notice about this record is that it very obviously and transparently doesn't take any influence from heavy metal, and seems to take more influence from the world of psychedelic, progressive, and art rock. Take for instance a track like Liar's Funeral, which feels like a really perverse and melancholic version of Space Oddity from David Bowie, with its weird, soft-plucked acoustic guitars and transient vocals before evolving into something a lot more metallic and a lot more brooding. And that's not me pulling a big name out of my ass to grab your attention. The band themselves even have said that this song is kind of like if David Bowie recorded a black metal song. Don't know if I fully agree with the black metal comparison, but yeah, it does definitely have the essence of classic David Bowie, and it's also one of the most dynamic and interesting pieces on the entire record, maybe even my favorite song, personally speaking. And that's not the only one either. The track Spiders shows a lot of love for David Bowie, specifically the Berlin Trilogy era of David Bowie, when he worked with Brian Eno on albums like Low and Heroes, with an added dash of the more unorthodox elements of very early Nine Inch Nails, specifically Downward Spiral Nine Inch Nails, creating something very creepy and ominous and foreboding. The melodies are really weird and spooky, and there's a lot of weird sounds that often poke their head directly into the forefront. And it even manages to accomplish all of this without using a lot of really heavy electric guitar. Like, there's not really a riff or solo at any point in here, and honestly, you don't need it. And when a lot of these influences or sounds are implemented even further into the core Slipknot sound, it creates for some really devastating fucking material. Take, for instance, album closer, Solway Firth, which is, in my opinion, one of the heaviest fucking things that Slipknot has ever fucking created. It is actually the one song on here that I argue is on par with some of the stuff from Iowa and Volume 3. It's just so fucking dirty and dramatic and weird all at the same time. And the album as a whole also plays out a lot more like a concept album, which I really like. There isn't a narrative per se, but tracks do flow together quite nicely. The ending of one track often introduces another track. There are a lot of interesting little interludes. My favorite interlude on here has to be What's Next, because it just feels so fucking strange. This sounds like something that Radiohead would have made after doing a shitload of fucking cocaine. Opening track Insert Coin is also really interesting, and perhaps one of the most obvious and blatant examples of Slipknot's newfound influence in prog and psychedelic rock, as it contains a literal homage to Pink Floyd. More importantly, it sets the tone for the record pretty quickly and paves the way quite nicely for lead single Unscented, which on surface level looks like one of the more obvious Slipknot kind of songs. I mean, it's got a big crazy chorus, it's got lots of banging percussion, but dig a little deeper and you find a lot more. I gotta be honest too, I wasn't really digging this song as a promo single when it first came out, but now it's fucking stuck in my head like a motherfucker. That chorus is really goddamn effective. And it's not just because of Corey Taylor's highly improved clean vocals, it also has a lot to do with the choir. The choir is really fucking effective. It's spooky, it's powerful, it's commanding. It immediately grabs your attention when the track opens up. And to add to the sonic chaos of this, Slipknot have cram-packed this full of weird electronics and drum tracks and all kinds of shit. I'm really fascinated and intrigued by the conceptual, progressive nature of this record. I really can't think of any other mainstream metal band that is really pushing themselves to make something so album-centric in an industry that is now obsessed with just making these quick little cash-grabbing singles. Which is why I honestly find it kind of disappointing that throughout the rest of the record, Slipknot seem borderline obsessed with revisiting the sounds and aesthetics of their first couple records. Which isn't to say these songs still can't be effective. I think Birth of the Cruel is pretty strong and it's got a weird, eerie hook to back it up, and I do like the all-out rage of fucking Red Flag. But as I said before, it just creates a really weird contrast when you have so many songs that are so ambitious and so highly detailed, and then you have another bunch of just Slipknot jams that, yeah, they are more modern and they do have some ideas that are inherently more different, I guess. But not to the point where if you told me that this was actually featured on Slipknot's first album, I wouldn't believe you. And maybe this is where me and everyone else, maybe this is where we separate, but that's just how I feel. And even ignoring the contrast that these songs create, I just don't think that they really succeed at what they're trying to do. Again, they're pretty fun little jams, but none of them quite come close to really recapturing the rage and the violence of those early records. And again, I don't think that's unfair to say because the band members have gone out of their way to compare this and rise it up to the level of those early records. And I don't want to hear the argument that maybe it's just because you're older, Robert, you just don't get it because you weren't there, because I still really like those fucking records. I think Iowa is honestly a fucking modern metal masterpiece. It's just so fucking fantastic from start to finish. So hectic and crazy and dark and powerful. Whereas a lot of the songs on here, again, are a very blatant attempt to just recapture those themes and not really do a whole lot with them. Which is ultimately a huge missed opportunity when, again, there's half of this fucking record that is really trying to push Slipknot into really ambitious and progressive territory. Perhaps it's a good thing that this isn't a full concept album then, because if it was, I would actually be judging it even harsher for that, because it would literally fuck the concept. I know it sounds like I'm bitching and moaning and I just hate this part of the record, but I really don't. I still think there's a lot to really enjoy here if you are a fan of that classic Slipknot sound, particularly that first album. And I think Corey Taylor's on fucking fire on all these tracks vocally. He hasn't sounded this fucking monstrous and vicious in a while. It also helps that he's penning lyrics about his toxic relationship, so he's fueled by something really bitter and powerful and personal, and that's awesome. I just wish that these songs were still musically and conceptually as ambitious as the rest of the record. It's by no means a deal breaker, but it does prevent me from giving this the insane level of praise that so many are giving it. That being said, I'll happily settle on a 3.5 out of 5 for this. I would say that despite my criticisms, this is still Slipknot's most interesting record in a long fucking time. It's definitely their best one since Volume 3. I mean, I personally didn't care much for All Hope Is Gone, and off the top of my head, I can only really remember 2 or 3 songs from fucking the Grey Chapter. Mind you, that record was still very emotional and cathartic, so it's, you know, I guess it gets a bit of a pass in that aspect. Point being is that I was much more invested in Slipknot this time around, more so than I've been in a very long time. Definitely safe to say that the diehard Slipknot fans, the maggots as some call them, they're going to have a fucking blast with this record. Undoubtedly. You're going to love the really weird and twisted new material, and you're also going to love the straight up new metal fucking jams of this thing. You're going to love how dense it is. You're going to love how dark it is. You're going to love how chaotic it is. You're going to love that as weird as it is at times, it is still characteristically Slipknot. You're going to have a fucking ball. And I would even recommend this to naysayers for that matter, because there are some really interesting ideas and concepts and pieces thrown onto this record. Like, I never ever thought that there would ever come a day where I would compare David Bowie to fucking Slipknot, but here we fucking are. That's the point that Slipknot has evolved to as songwriters and musicians. And I hope that the success of these experiments inspires Slipknot to actually do a full-blown concept album. I'm really curious to see them capitalize and expand on everything that they've established here. Mind you, given Slipknot's track record, that album probably wouldn't come out for like 5 years or anything, but still, something to think of. So there you have it, 3.5 out of 5. I don't think it's the masterpiece that everyone is clamoring it to be, but hey, maybe I'm just in the minority. Maybe I'm just a sour old fart. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe to you this is a masterpiece, and by all means, if that's the case, go fucking nuts. Have a goddamn blast, because I don't think there's any arguing regardless that this is still their strongest record since Volume 3. It's definitely the most I've been personally invested and interested in them since Volume 3. And I'm really excited to see what kind of doors this opens for Slipknot in the future. And I'm excited to see if this inspires other mainstream rock and metal artists to push themselves a little further as well. 3.5 out of 5. A flawed but still extremely good fucking record. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.